Hafa and welcome to this series about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. These episodes introduce the latest research and discussions about ancient life, history, and cultural traditions all across our diverse region of Micronesia. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together.
In Western Micronesia, Palau has shown a deep and extensive archaeological record. Scott Fitzpatrick shares about his years of researching the archaeology of Palau.
I'm going to introduce you to archaeology that I've been working on in Palau for the last 25 years or so. First, let's look at the geographical context and cultural chronology of Palau. It's a long stretch of islands, most of which are limestone and locally called the Rock Islands. These have lots of limestone caves and rock shelters. These islands really just formed as a result of uplifted coral reef systems that eroded over time. And then we also have a couple larger volcanic islands or ones that are partially volcanic, including Babeldaw, which is the second largest island in Micronesia after Guam. These rock islands are really what attracted me first as a researcher and archaeologist and became part of my dissertation research at the University of Oregon. It's not more than a few hundred miles away from Yap, a little farther south from Guam as well, and it's considered to be fairly remote and difficult to get to for a number of reasons, including challenging winds and currents that surround the archipelago. This just shows you a good overview of what some of the rock islands in Palau look like. They look like clumps of broccoli from the air, and if you're in a kayak paddling around, they look like maybe mushrooms that have erupted out of the water because the bottoms of those have been eroding over time, and they sit on these pedestals or with these little notches in them. They have really rich marine ecosystem, lots of different kinds of microecologies, and quite a few endemic species. In terms of what we know generally about Palauan archaeology, we think that people first got there between about 3,300 and 3,000 years ago, something on par with when the Marianas were settled. And that's probably a result of peoples coming from somewhere in Southeast Asia. We don't know necessarily if they're coming from the Philippines or parts of Indonesia, maybe even parts of New Guinea. It might be a mixture of those together, different populations coming in at maybe around the same time. But the genetics, the linguistics, the archaeology seem to point somewhere in Southeast Asia, which of course makes a lot of sense. Around 2,400 years ago, we start to see something happening in Palau that's pretty interesting and seen really nowhere else in the Pacific. And that's the construction of earthwork terraces and other sort of landscape modifications. So basically, peoples are taking the landscape and they're modifying that. What this illustrates is that peoples are utilizing the interior parts of the larger islands like Babeldaw and Koror, and these are providing, I think, a number of different functions, at least from what the archaeology says so far. Dozens of these are found on mostly the volcanic islands in Palau, and there's estimates that even about 20% or so of Babeldaw is comprised of these earthwork terraces. About 1,500 years later, we start to see peoples seemingly moving from the inland areas down to the coast, and we see this eruption of stonework construction and the development of villages along the coast of Babeldaw and other islands. We see really extensive pathways, stone foundations, docks, bathing areas, all sorts of things that are constructed of stone and in many cases linking villages together. These are usually situated behind mangroves, probably as a defensive tactic. And we, as a result of this, seem to see populations grow. And then around 500 years ago, not long after this, we see something else happen, which is pretty interesting. And that's peoples from Yap coming down to Palau to quarry their famous stone money. And a lot of people know this story, at least a little bit. That was really what attracted me to go to Palau for the first time is, how did the Yapese really get down to Palau, carve these immense pieces of stone money and then bring them back? And how did Europeans become involved in this process? So that really was the impetus for me starting to do archaeology in Palau. And then another significant date is AD 1783. The British packet known as the Antelope wrecks on Oolong Island. Captain Wilson befriends some Palauans, and that really begins a drastic change in politics and economics. This is the site of El Oral Rock, and this has been a focus of my research for almost a quarter of a century now. It seems like a long time. This rock shelter was a stone money quarry. The Yappies came here. There's remnants of these pieces of stone money. There's remnants of stone architecture that were used as part of this process, including the development of a dock. We know that this dates within the last probably 400 or 500 years, and that's really what I was interested in. So we went here, but we also began, as we excavated, to find deeper deposits, and these dated back to around 3,000 or so years ago. We have these human-constructed terraces. A lot of them are devoid of vegetation. They seem to have been developed not for agriculture, as what a lot of people thought earlier, but were probably symbolic and defensive. These are very prominent features on the landscape. We see a number of different varieties of these crown and brims, some evidence that they were building ditches and palisades. Really prominent, important features to Palauans in the deep past. And these would have required the labor of hundreds of people over years and years to build and maintain. Then we get these stonework villages, foundations for houses, for residences, men's houses, canoe houses, really beautifully paved pathways, and so on. And an expansion of this through time, not only in the larger islands, but eventually in the rock islands as well. And then peoples from Yap come to Palau. They start carving these pieces of stone money, remnants of which are still in Palau today. Not very many of the larger ones are left, but we do see those, and I worked at a number of different sites. My research initially as a PhD student at the University of Oregon was to try and understand a little bit more about this exchange relationship between Palau and Yap vis-a-vis the quarrying of stone money. We see examples historically of stone money being used. Suffice to say, these somewhat portable artifacts were used extensively for centuries in Yap. We see some historical photos of these activities taking place. If you look closely around these pieces of stone money, you'll see 4 or 5 different Yapese quarry workers standing around those. You can see a cave in the background behind them. These pieces of stone money today, if you see them in Palau or Yap, are covered in coral and algae growth and dust and things like that. But when they were first carved, they would have been this brilliant milky white color and reflecting sunlight off their crystals, and really, really magnificent pieces. Here's some other historical photos showing scaffolding being used to access some of these limestone deposits. On the top right, you see a canoe house that's built below one of these rock islands. And then on the bottom right, you see some pieces of stone money being used in Yap as a decoration or placement in front of a house. So that brings us to El Oral Rock. This basically means the beach of Orak Island, and Orak Island is a rock island just off the southeast coast of Babeldaw. This is the beach that covers the front of it, and some of my students who are carrying buckets of water for wet screening one of our years of excavation there. We've excavated primarily in the central part of the rock shelter. This was not only the flattest part, but it was also the area where peoples probably would have centered their activity. All of those squares that you see are excavation units in different years. We've opened up about 12, 13 square meters or so. And then you see a number of different features, architectural features around, including rock walls, the dock, scatters of limestone debitage or flakes just from quarrying stone money. And again, this is what I was mostly interested in going to the site for the first time. This gives you a view from a newly constructed dock into the rock shelter. It's kind of obscured a little bit by vegetation, but gives you an idea of what it looks like at sea level. And then looking down onto our excavation northward, just to give you an idea of the scope and size of this rock shelter. We've done excavations at this site on 5 different field seasons between 2000 and 2015. These have involved students from North Carolina State University, where I used to work, the University of Oregon, and then Palauans from the Historic Preservation Office. The thing that really was striking when we began working at the site is that we have gotten down about 1 meter deep. And you can see in the top right that the top 50 centimeters or so is really dark soil. This is comprised of 2 different kinds of occupation in use. The very top is from the Yapese living and working by carving their stone money. And then below that, we have Palauan use of this site. From my interpretation, very similar to what Palauans do today. They go out to these rock islands, they have a shelter, some kind of rock shelter or enclosed area. They fish, they camp, they hang out with their families and friends, and they do that repetitively over periods of time. And we get these little lenses, burned material. You can pretty much see that peoples have been doing this for what amounts to be about 1,500 years. And then there's a stark difference between that and this kind of yellowish brown coral sand that's below this. This is the natural sand that was part of this site initially, and peoples began using this really for the first time in order to bury the dead. That's really one of the reasons why we continued working at this site, completely unexpected, going into this thinking that we had a few centuries of use of this site for one specific activity, and then finding what we would call a multi-component site. It's just used for different kinds of things over long periods of time. Some of the material culture that we get at this site is really great. Of course, not dissimilar to what we see in other parts of Micronesia or the Pacific. Peoples are using a lot of shell for tools, for ornaments, for making fishing lures, all sorts of different things. And this is just a small representation of what we have here. We see on the top left a conus shell bead. On the top right, this is Trochus niloticus, and this is a bracelet that is finished and whole, which is great. On the bottom, we see pearl shell scraper graters. These are tools that were known ethnographically and historically in Palau to have been used for primarily, in some cases probably exclusively by women, for scraping and grating tubers, coconut, and things like that. And they have a serrated edge that's been made for that purpose. These artifacts were also known as a form of women's money. So they were extremely valuable, but also functional. Here's a few more examples of different kinds of shell tools, drilled bits. Some of these are probably used as fishing lures. Probably the one in the middle here used as a practice by somebody who's trying to hone their craft. A lot of different examples of these. It's not uncommon to find longer shell pieces used in necklaces as spacers to make sure that the necklaces don't get all tangled up. Some other shell tools include adzes. We find the occasional fish hook. That one on the bottom right is also made from Trochus niloticus, and it's got that lustrous character to it. Some different kinds of shell adzes made out of a giant clam or tridacna, some made out of terebra, like the bottom two. Bone artifacts are also occasionally found. Bone needles. The one in the middle is another fish hook, and then some other types of ornamentation or scraping tools. And then a number of miscellaneous artifacts as well. We get a drilled shark tooth in the top right. There's a carapace that's been modified and shaped on the top left. Some cordage at the top levels. This isn't very common, but we do get good preservation of the site, enough for the preservation of even what would normally be more perishable materials like this cordage. And then the occasional stone artifact, like a green stone adze in the bottom right. We even found a piece of stone money in one of our excavations, not in the rock shelter itself, but outside of it, buried in the sand, and we saw this at low tide. And then because we are seeing use of this site during the juncture of European contact and maybe even the introduction of more Asian or European goods before European contact, we have a nice little selection of glass beads which were introduced. And we have in Palau a very well-known tradition of using bead money. Just generally, these are often referred to as udod, and these are almost exclusively worn by women, clay and glass beads. There's been quite a bit of ethnographic and other anthropological style research that have examined this. Suffice to say, still an important tradition. Historically, we see some very prominent beads being used and just considered to be very valuable types of objects. Most of these, maybe almost all of these, were introduced from the outside. We published a paper looking at the chemical composition of these beads. A lot of these are Bohemian. These derive from modern day Czech Republic. And even one that, according to our bead expert, is a style and composition that's only been found elsewhere outside of Europe at one archaeological site in the Southeast United States. So maybe some rare types as well. Now, people who are living in Palau, as well as other islands around Micronesia, are exploiting a wide variety of different resources and a lot of marine resources. At El Orak, we get a lot of faunal remains, a lot of fish, a lot of shellfish. And this is a testament to people's harvesting these resources and relying on them as sources of protein. And what we have to remember about a lot of islands in the Pacific is that they have an impoverished terrestrial fauna. So there's really not a lot of mammals and sometimes no mammals. Terrestrial sources of protein are very difficult to find, and birds are one of those. But apart from birds, there's not a lot typically. As a result, peoples need to have some kind of protein consumption, and that almost exclusively comes from the sea. One of the interesting things, just in providing a general trend of what's happening at Orak over time, is that fishing is declining. So people's pretty early on, let's say around 1500 years ago, where we start to see really good information about this at the site, we see lots of fish. And then these gradually decline over time. But what happens is that we start to see an increase in the consumption of shellfish or mollusks. Peoples have to get their protein from somewhere. Why they're deciding to not fish as much, at least around this site, is unknown. But we do see a prevalence of shellfish being harvested and consumed at the site compared to fish. So fish go down and mollusks go up. We've published a couple different papers on looking at this fishing. This includes the analysis of thousands of fish bones from just a small portion of the site. We have come to the conclusion that the decline in fishing isn't a result of human impacts. They're not over harvesting fish and there's just a lot less there. It seems to be a result of just people's changing their subsistence preferences and practices. When we look at the mollusks or the shellfish, we have 44 different families, almost 100 different kinds of shellfish taxa. We've analyzed really what is a small portion of this, but still in the thousands. What we see is that they're dominated primarily by two different species. One is A. striata, which is that small little surf clam on the bottom, and the other one is a result of eating Gibberellus gibberellus, which is a species or a strombin. There's an increasing dominance by only a few of these over time, and an increase in shellfish consumption that coincides with this decrease in fishing. And this is how it plays out statistically. We see these trends happening with numbers over a period of about 1,500 years. One thing that we expect as archaeologists is if people are consuming an increasing amount of food of a specific species, we tend to see a decline in the size of that species. We went into this research thinking that was probably the case, but we wanted to test it. We took this species of Gibberellus gibberellus. We measured 1,400 of those from about 3,000 to the present. There was actually an increase in size through time. And this is contradictory to what we would expect. And we were wondering, well, is this related to culture or environmental changes, perhaps? This is a comparison between the Caribbean and Pacific. At the top, this is an illustration of one of these traditional stonework village sites situated behind the mangrove with access to canoes and these lagoons. You can see at the top of this illustration one of these earthworks. As people maybe are clearing vegetation to expose those, they're then moving down and harvesting or growing taro in these artificial swamplands, which is a unique way to harvest these in Micronesia. So Palauans are doing it a little bit differently. Sedimentation from erosion from the inland areas, also from taro, is coming in and maybe adding more sediment to this lagoon, which could have been a preferential habitat for some of these species. We also think that this whole process of people's moving down from inland areas to these stonework villages and accessing lagoons, maybe some offshore areas, is a very intricate way for Palauans to develop conservation practices. They're growing in population. They need to grow more food. As populations grow, they're taxing the environments in ways that they hadn't before. And Palauans seem to be responding to some of these environmental changes and redirecting their energy to make sure that they're not over-harvesting foods. The archaeological evidence from Orak, this small little island offshore from Bab el Dab, seems to be capturing some of what's happening here. They're eating a lot more food, but they're not seemingly impacting the environment as a result. But suffice to say, we began finding human burials that these date back to between about 3000 to 1700 BP. To date, we have a cemetery with more than 50 individuals. Not all of these are complete burials. Some of these are just fragmentary, but about 28 are complete or semi-partial, along with thousands of isolated bones. This is coral sand, and the peoples are using this repetitively over hundreds of years. As they dig a hole to bury one, later on, they can dig through that burial to displace what were these individuals that had been placed there before. It causes a complicated picture that you have to reconstruct. It's like having a 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and you have about 1,000 pieces of it. And you're trying to put these back together to form a picture of what's happening. Palauans are using this site for about 1,500 years for human burials, which is a practice that you see in other rock islands. You see peoples using this then as an occupation or a temporary camp. And then the Yapese are coming in, practicing their stone money quarrying. So this is just a small little synopsis of what is happening at this important archaeological site. And we're continuing research on this in the future to try and elucidate some more of these clues about these early settlement patterns in Palau and then what happens afterward.
Thank you for joining us in learning about ancient sites and traditions of Micronesia. If you would like to learn more details, then I encourage you to visit, in person or online, the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.